Hello and welcome to My Victorian Nightmare. I'm your host, Genevieve Mannion, and I'm here to talk about mysterious deaths, morbid fascinations, disturbing stories, and otherwise spooky events from the Victorian era. Because to me, there's just something especially intriguing, creepy, and oddly comforting about horror and mayhem from the 19th century. So, listener discretion is advised. This is my second podcast, and I have been so touched by the feedback after the first episode. Strange as it may sound, macabre Victorian history is a strange kind of therapy for me. I can't explain it, but it means a lot to know that it's resonating with some other messed up people, so thank you. I really hope you're getting help for your problems. If you would be so kind, please rate this podcast in Spotify if you're enjoying it. That will let me know if I should continue digging deeper into this particular abyss. And it will also let Spotify know if I'm worthy of reaching a greater audience. So that would really mean a lot to me. Thank you kindly. Today, I'm going to cover the Victorian cult of death. This was a cult whose members were just about all of Victorian society. From England to Australia, all over Europe to the United States, death was an entire way of life in the 1800s. It was fashion, literature, photography, spirituality, tchotchkes that you'd bake into cakes like frozen Charlotte figurines. Those were little dead porcelain girls that were all the rage at the time. It was a creepy era. And so, I'm going to do a deep dive into the elaborate funeral traditions, what was and was not acceptable mourning fashion of the day, Queen Victoria's obsession with her dead husband that sparked the trends, the hardship and power of 19th century widowhood, as well as the almost fetishistic keepsaking of the deceased. We'll also take a little tour to discuss exactly what folks were dying of in those days, and I promise not to describe anything in too great detail, but what I do mention will probably give you a good idea about why these people needed to try extra hard to make it fashion. Death in these days simply could not be ignored. The cultural origins of this cult of death can be traced to Queen Victoria herself. She was born in 1819 and ruled England from 1837 until her death in 1901. Her husband, Prince Albert, died of typhoid in 1862, although there's some belief that this was actually Crohn's disease that he died of. That's still apparently up for debate. He died with the Queen and his 5 children by his bedside. Queen Victoria was wrecked by his death and chose to wear traditional black mourning dresses until her own death in 1901. There was much etiquette surrounding mourning before Victoria, but being a royal, she infused mourning fashion of the day with an air of elegance, sophistication, and style. It's also important to note that at the time of Albert's death, the public was increasingly questioning the worth of monarchy in England and Victoria's huge expenditures, just like Queen Elizabeth's death recently. But this was expertly quelled by Victoria's very public showing of grief, promoting an outpouring of public support. I'll also discuss the specifics of mourning fashion in a little bit, but I just want to tell you a little about Victoria's specific, creepy obsession with her dead husband first, because it's fascinating. Apart from wearing black for the rest of her life, she had her husband's clothes laid out for him daily. They would place his shaving cup and hot water in his room. They would have to clean his chamber pot, and they would change his sheets every morning. The glass that he used to take his last sip of medicine was never washed, and it didn't leave his bedside table for 4 decades. And in virtually every family portrait until Victoria's death, a bust of Prince Albert was included. The chamber pot thing is the creepiest thing to me. Like, she had to give that specific directive. Lay out the clothes, change the sheets, make sure his ghost didn't use the toilet. Moving right along. Her style sat right with people around the world also dealing with seemingly endless pandemics. There were 6 in the 19th century and many horrifying diseases. Of course, there had been plenty of horrifying diseases leading up to the 19th century, but the development of more densely populated cities, towns, and urban areas helped disease move more quickly than ever before and made it more difficult to escape the reality of it. The average lifespan in 1830 for middle to upper middle class males was 44 years old. That is more than a decade younger than Paul Rudd. That is horrible. It was 25 for tradesmen and 22 for laborers. 57 out of 100 children in working class families died by age 5. It's wild to think of all the childhood illnesses I've had and the sticky situations that modern medical science helped me escape. I easily would have been one of those children. Hospitals were less places to heal the sick and more places where people were just sent to be forgotten, often referred to as houses of death because they were filled with the smell of rotting flesh and body fluids, and you could hear people screaming through the walls as doctors would perform on them without anesthesia. Interestingly, anesthesia was first used in 1846 by William T.G. Morton. He used ether on a friend while he removed a tumor from his neck. Not until the 1920s were other anesthetic agents used when ethylene was introduced. This doctor's partner, Horace Wells, died in January 1848 when he became deranged by overexposure to chloroform and committed suicide while in jail after assaulting a sex worker. Ether was a popular drug at this time, if you were lucky enough to get it. Doctors and pharmacists commonly used it, and they called getting high on ether frolicking, which is adorable. It wasn't uncommon for these guys to go on a little frolic, fall down, and bang their heads in. This information led me to believe that all the derangement, suicide, and concussions probably contributed to the slow adoption of anesthesia for some time to come. Suffice it to say, hospitals were horror shows for many reasons at this time, so people more often chose to die in the home if they were able. It was common for a family member to stay close when someone appeared to be on death's door to keep company, but especially to hear last words. Victorians greatly valued last words. They were often written as epitaphs on gravestones, and the use of pain-reducing drugs like morphine was discouraged to ensure dying people were as lucid as possible. Last words were so valued because it was believed that the meaning of life could only truly be realized on the edge of death. A few famous last words. This one from Sir William Erskine. He was an officer and a member of Parliament in 1813. After jumping out a window, he said, "Now why did I do that?" John Keats, English poet who died in 1821, said, "I can feel the daisies growing over me." Ooh. Beethoven has at least 2 statements believed as last words. Shortly before he died in 1827, it was written that he said, "Pity, pity, too late," after hearing his publisher gifted him 12 bottles of wine. I've also read that his real last words were actually, "Friends applaud, the comedy is over," after the priest read his last rites. I didn't know Beethoven was that pithy. My favorite last words are Oscar Wilde's, who said, "This wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. Either it goes, or I do." He died in 1900. And if you've seen Titanic, it's actually true that Benjamin Guggenheim was heard to say, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." But in the movie he shouts, "But we would like a brandy." That part wasn't actually said by Guggenheim, but the same witness who heard that first statement said he and his personal assistant were later seen on the deck chairs sipping brandy and smoking cigars as the boat sank. So I'm sure writers took inspiration from that fact for the script. A few noteworthy diseases at the time. We had smallpox, typhoid fever, yellow fever, cholera. Oh God, cholera. You die by basically losing all of your body fluids from everywhere you're able to lose them in a matter of a few gruesome hours, and essentially you die of dehydration. And then there was tuberculosis, otherwise known as consumption due to its slow consumption of the body. Historically speaking, tuberculosis was, and may still be, the greatest killer ever known to mankind, considering how long it's been killing. It goes as far back as the ancient Egyptians and Hippocrates. It was called Captain of All These Men of Death by John Bunyan. He was a Puritan English writer in the 1600s. It has killed over 1 billion people in just the last 200 years. Syphilis was also rampant in the 1800s. One of my favorite lines from Coppola's Dracula is when Anthony Hopkins, as Dr. Van Helsing, is giving a class on diseases of the blood. He says, "Civilization and syphilization have advanced together." Classic. Franz Schubert, he died of typhoid. He also had syphilis and was given the conventional treatment at the time, which was mercury, which caused him and everyone else treated with mercury a great deal of problems like trouble sleeping, twitching, slurred speech, and depression. His is a particularly tragic story. He wrote the most famous Ave Maria of all time. It's the one used in the Batman movie with Robert Pattinson. He was only 31 when he died, and he wrote so much music in his lifetime. On his deathbed, a string quartet played for him Beethoven's String Quartet No. 14 in C-sharp minor, which is a very intense piece. This is what that was. Once his friends were done playing, the leader of the quartet, Karl Holz, said the King of Harmony has sent the King of Song a friendly bidding to the crossing. Tchaikovsky, who wrote The Nutcracker and Swan Lake, died of cholera at age 53 in 1893. I also found out that he was gay when researching this. He also had a gay brother. What are the odds? Schubert, also potentially gay. That is up for debate. But with Tchaikovsky, there is some mystery around his death. He drank a glass of water that must have been cholera infected and was dead in just a few hours after experiencing the horrible diarrheal and vomiting symptoms. The mystery is that some believe he knew it was cholera infected and was committing suicide. At this time, cholera was particularly prevalent in Petersburg, where he lived, and he didn't boil his water before drinking. Some note that he was a huge drinker of alcohol, notorious for getting hammered with his buddy Johannes Brahms regularly, and may have just been drunk and careless when he didn't boil the water first. But it's often noted how ironic a glass of water killed him instead of the copious amounts of vodka that he drank. It's all very tragic, nonetheless. Let's talk more about the mourning fashions and etiquette that were inspired by Queen Victoria after her husband's death. This is fascinating. The fashion and etiquette was fairly similar between Europe and the United States, although we were a little more relaxed here. For example, in American Victorian society, a woman was expected to wear black for 12 months and a day after the death of her husband, whereas in England, it was expected she would do so for 2 full years. A woman could always choose to wear black longer than 2 years, but she would be expected to continue adhering to mourning rules, which were quite restrictive and very specific. A woman couldn't go to parties or happy affairs for a full 2 years after the death. Activities were essentially restricted to church and intimate home gatherings. In England, a woman was expected to wear a drab black dress made of crepe, referred to as full widow's weeds, without any jewelry or ornament on her dress. She was expected to wear a weeping veil, that's a huge black veil, when in public, and a cap indoors. After a year, they could switch the fabric of the dress to silk. It could now include minor ornamentation and mourning jewelry. Queen Victoria popularized jewelry with jet, which is essentially coal crushed into gemstone. That's where we get the saying jet black. It wasn't an expensive stone, so it was easy to find and afford. This period of silk and mourning jewelry would last 9 months. They were no longer expected to wear their full veil in front of their face. They could pull it back. Elderly widows tended to stay in this stage of mourning fashion until their own death. Once the 9 months had passed for younger widows, they could then transition to purple, then gray, then white in a period called half mourning. But also, whether you were mourning or not, black became one of the most fashionable colors of the time, so it wasn't reserved only for mourning. It was mainly the fabrics, ornamentation, or lack of ornamentation that set clothing apart. Crepe, the most common fabric used for mourning dresses, was made from crinkled, lightweight silk and was itself a very hazardous fabric, very flammable, and would also disintegrate in the rain and shrivel. Many of the dyes used to color the crepe black were toxic. Logwood dye, made from a Central American flowering tree, contains hematoxylin. This causes eye and skin irritation, as well as respiratory problems. Chromium, a highly toxic substance, was used to set dyes. It can cause all kinds of horrible problems. They also used potassium dichromate, which would make the hands of people who worked with the dye swollen and ulcerated. Just being around it would eventually make your toes and jaw become swollen as well. They were also mixing coal tar dyes that contained benzene with potassium dichromate and copper chloride, all highly toxic, as well as arsenic, obviously. Constant breathing through the fabric was quite dangerous and made women very sick, and their symptoms were no doubt dismissed as hysteria. In America, the wearing of black mourning dresses peaked after the Civil War, which is estimated to have killed between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers. The war lasted from 1861 to 1865. I found 2 resources that said wearing black was effectively banned in a Mississippi town because it was bumming people out too much. I could not find the source of that information, though, to confirm that it was true, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was. When it came to men, it was also expected that they'd be in mourning for up to 2 years, but unlike women, believe it or not, they weren't expected to isolate themselves and could go about life pretty much just as they did before the death of the wife. Children wore white with black trim or black with white trim, depending on the season. Black in winter and white in summer. But they were never expected to wear mourning clothes longer than a year. The same goes for any girl under 17 years old, but any older than 17, however, she would be expected to go full crepe and veil. Mourning wear was often used to show one's wealth. A woman would wear black and dress all of her servants in mourning wear as well, just to be extra about it. In regard to widows, women often relied on their families and relations, charity, community support, and the goodwill of religious organizations to survive if they hadn't inherited wealth. Although it is notable that widows remarried much less frequently than widowers. I'm sure much of that was just men not wanting to marry widows, but a great deal of women decided they just didn't want to ever be married again. In a legal sense, women were listed as either married or to be married, and laws would apply accordingly. However, a widow, in the eyes of the law, could speak for herself. Inheritance laws were shifting, and women in this time would have to vastly change their lives in order to survive the death of a husband. They ran farms, small holdings, begged, borrowed, became nurses, governesses, teachers, nuns, and some amassed fortunes. In a time where men were the gatekeepers of employment and the owners of property and power, a powerful man's widow would have been introduced to an independence and influence she wouldn't experience any other way at the time. When an English woman named Eliza Ainsley was widowed in 1851, her husband's nail-making business was left to his son, who died a year later. She inherited that business, as well as her father-in-law's business. It became the largest chain and nail business in Stratfordshire, and by 1871, the company employed 4,000 people. She was known locally as the Widow. She was known as a fair and kind employer at the time when nail makers were terribly exploited. She sold the company in 1872, but the name remained Eliza Ainsley and Company. A bit about funeral traditions, etiquette, and social practices after the death of a loved one. If a woman's husband died, for example, his widow would cover all of the mirrors and photos in the house. Interestingly, traditions as old as the Maya and Greeks believed reflective surfaces were portals to spiritual worlds. I personally will keep my eyes down and away from mirrors when I go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. I've always felt ghosts can watch you through mirrors, but I also watch a lot of horror movies, so that doesn't help. When Victorians covered mirrors, it was believed that this would prevent the spirit from getting stuck in the house. However, I also read that windows and curtains were drawn so the soul would stick around at least for the funeral. Then, windows would be open to allow the spirit to leave. Bodies were often placed in sitting rooms for family and friends to pay respects, and wakes would last up to 4 days. The long wake served as a kind of safeguard from burying someone alive who was in a coma. I go quite deep into the fears surrounding live burials in my last podcast about Octavia Hatcher. Some people believe funeral flowers began in Victorian times, but this isn't true. They have evidence of funeral flowers going back as far as 62,000 years ago. But they were a very practical addition to Victorian funerals, nevertheless, not just for their beauty, but useful for their stench masking. There was also an interesting superstition that I found where deceased people were carried out of their homes feet first to ensure that the dead spirit would not face a family member on their way out and beckon their spirit to come with them. The size of your funeral determined how loved you were by your family. This led to the creation of ornate glass coffin carriages, intricate headstones, and mausoleums. The death industry was as lucrative as the wedding industry is today. You could get dishes, stationery, and mourning decorations. And if you could afford it, you could even hire professional mourners to come to a funeral and emote to your specified level of sadness. This could be silent weeping to full-on wailing. This sounds pretty cut and dry, but I don't know if people had to do auditions for things like this. What if a widower paid a bunch of ladies to come and wail for his wife, but they weren't dramatic enough or they were too dramatic? I just feel like awkward scenarios must have abounded around this practice. Once the funeral ended, the widow would have to isolate herself inside, only attend church and intimate family gatherings for the next 1 to 2 years as mentioned, which is really sad. They would lock pianos so they couldn't hear music. Carriages would also be draped in black fabric, and doorbells would even be covered in black crepe. I believe this was a way to inform a person that the home was in mourning and to act accordingly when the door was answered. It would also indicate that a person should have a very good reason to ring it, no encyclopedia salesman. Drawing on old traditions of sin eaters, people who ate bread that had been placed on a corpse's chest to absorb the sins, Victorian funerals often included pastries like biscuits and cookies. They'd place the cookies on the chests of the dead first, but not necessarily to absorb sins. It was to absorb their spirit so you could take a piece of them with you. The concept of soul or spirit in this time was a very tactile one. It could get stuck in places, be broken into pieces, it could be eaten. I wonder if it's a similar concept to our splitting up ashes between family members nowadays, like keeping a little piece of them with you. These funeral cookies were so popular and so required in this time that bakeries began to market them in packages with mourning poems, prayers, and death notices. They would openly advertise in their windows, quote, "funeral cookies made to order on the shortest notice." I found an example of a mourning poem written in the wrapping of one of these cookies, and my Lord, listen to this. "Thee we adore, eternal name, and humbly bow to thee. How feeble is our mortal frame, what dying worms we be. Our wasting lives grow shorter still, as days and months increase, and every beating pulse we tell leaves but the number less." The year rolls round and steals away the breath that first it gave. Wherever we do, wherever we be, we're traveling to the grave. For God's sake. The cookies were simple and included molasses, ginger, and caraway seeds. They were made with ornate cookie presses, so they looked very pretty. Another common and disturbing practice, at least to us now, were the creation of what were called Memento mori, which literally means remember you must die. These mementos were essentially keepsakes of the dead, and they weren't just photos. You've probably seen the creepy photos of family members surrounding a dead body that's been propped up. We'll talk more about that in a minute. These keepsakes were also objects, like death masks. This was a plaster cast of a freshly deceased person's face that would then be used for a number of reasons. A tool for making busts, effigies, or other objects of veneration. Another fascinating reason these were created, specifically of criminals in Australia, was for the study of phrenology. Phrenologists divided the head into 35 sections called faculties. They would make a mold of these people's heads, study the bumps and shapes, take some notes, and use this data as an early form of criminal psychology. They believed the bumps would prove or predict the existence of a criminal type or class. They were very wrong. but it's still fascinating. Another form of memento mori were paintings or drawings done of a corpse within those 4 days of wake, or directly after death. A drawing of Charles Dickens was done just after he died, and his daughter wrote the sweetest thank you note to the artist. It read, "My dear Mr. Malleus, C," it's a little unclear exactly what it says, "C has just brought down your drawing. It is quite impossible to describe the effect it has had on us. No one but for yourself, I think, could have so perfectly understood the beauty and pathos of his dear face as it lay on that little bed in the dining room. Thank you, dear Mr. Malleus, for giving it to me. There is nothing in the world I have, or can ever have, that I shall value half as much. I think you know this, although I can find so few words to tell you how grateful I am." I'll put this drawing on the Instagram at My Victorian Nightmare. It's very sweet. So was the drawing done of Virginia Poe, Edgar Allan Poe's wife, who died very young of tuberculosis. If you look her up on Wikipedia, the image that you see of her in the article is the drawing of her dead. Next week's episode will be the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe, so make sure to subscribe to get that to pop up in your feed. For some, the creation of these mementos was almost fetishistic. They would fill parlors and sitting rooms. Holding on to pieces of the dead was important. They would take locks of their hair to keep in lockets, brooches, and bracelets. Hair was a common part of mourning jewelry. They would also use it for rings, earrings, watch fobs, and necklaces. They'd make ornate wreaths with long hair. They'd use it to make needle-pointed floral artwork around photos of the dead. They'd even use hair to make something like bonsai trees that they'd put under glass domes. Hair art was all the rage, as were the photos. Memorial portraiture thrived in the 1800s. Post-mortem photography was becoming very common. Photography of dead bodies, victims of disease and murder, as well as murder scenes, were just becoming useful tools of documentation. For many middle-class and lower-middle-class families, the only photo of a relative would be one taken after they died. In the early 19th century, it was customary to paint the portraits of wealthy young children who died, usually illustrating the child alive, but with a symbol of some sort to indicate death, like an anchor, lily of the valley, forget-me-nots, weeping willows, and less subtle, coffins, angels, and crosses. But with the advent of the daguerreotype in 1839, it was more mainstream for the well-to-do to have a photo taken instead of a painting. The photo image was captured to a silver-clad copper sheet, which was attached to a sheet of glass by a foil-like brass decorative frame. It wasn't very expensive, but it wasn't cheap either. The deceased would often be laid out as if they were asleep, babies were held in arms or placed in bassinets, children were often propped up with braces or even tied to the arm of a family member by their side to hold them up. Sometimes they'd be tied to other kids, which is unimaginable. Subjects would have to be perfectly still for 10 to 15 minutes in very bright lighting. The most traumatizing 15 minutes of some of these kids' lives, I'm sure. Grown adults were often braced into a seated position or leaning them up against another family member. Again, traumatic. They could also be discreetly tied to objects to keep them propped up. As the demand for these photographs picked up, photographers started making more enhanced photography, such as painting open eyes over the closed eyes of a corpse. They would also offer to paste the eyelids open. One of the most disturbing photos I think I have ever seen has a little baby on a rocking horse with his eyes pasted open and just looking terrified. The look on his face literally haunts my dreams. You could also have a pink tint applied to the cheeks to give them a little healthy glow once the photo was developed. You'll see those pictures as well on the Instagram. Well, that was all very depressing. I am very sorry you had to hear all that. It's all just terrible. But here's something to make you feel a little bit better. Just a few very funny last words from the era. There was John Sedgwick. He was a general for the Union Army. His last words were, "They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." Female serial killer Lavinia Fisher said, "If any of you have a message for the devil, give it to me, for I'm about to meet him." And finally, there's another of Oscar Wilde's almost last words. He was given a glass of champagne on his deathbed, and he said, "I expect I shall have to also die beyond my means." Iconic. Once again, if you enjoy this podcast and want to hear more, please subscribe and rate this podcast on Spotify. Be kind to yourselves, and I will see you in your nightmares.